Great. Well, welcome. So today, my guest is Maurice Carlos Ruffin, and he is the author of a very recent New York Times Editor's Choice story collection called The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You. And that was published in August of 2021. His first book, a novel, We Cast a Shadow, was finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and the PEN American Open Book Award. He is the winner of several literary prizes, including the Iowa Review Award in fiction. He's a New Orleans native and a professor of creative writing at Louisiana State University and the 2020-2021 John and Renee Grisham Writer in Residence at the University of Mississippi, and the Grand Marshal for Mardi Gras in 2022 in New Orleans. So I'm very pleased to have this conversation today, and I have a bunch of questions to ask you about your writing, your teaching style, and New Orleans. And maybe we can just start with what it's like to be the Grand Marshal. And are you just a party going kind of guy, or how did that come about?
I'm not like Ernest Hemingway. I think like most writers, I'm pretty low key. It is very interesting though. So here in the background, I have this is my crew. The crew is Crew of House Floats, and the crews are the different sort of organizations who will parade or do whatever they do during Mardi Gras. So I'm one of several Grand Marshals in New Orleans, and this is my Grand Marshal staff that they gave me. Somebody made this with their bare hands. It's pretty cool. You see, it's this very sort of esoteric looking object, little house with some flowers on it. But you know, it's lovely. Being from New Orleans, it's a part of our culture. We love to celebrate life towards the end of winter. So Mardi Gras is next Tuesday, even though the overall calendar is a month long before it. So it's been ongoing for the past few weeks.
Well, I went to Mardi Gras once, and it was a long time ago, and it was a lot of crowds and parades and beads and a lot of fun. And I never expected to like it because I'm not that kind of party person, I guess. But I loved it. And I wonder if it's changed a lot since the pandemic or since all of the troubles that New Orleans has gone through with hurricanes and pandemics, et cetera.
Well, nothing is going to ever completely stop Mardi Gras in New Orleans because we love it so much. So last year during the pandemic, there were no parades because of the pandemic, but that's what created the Crew of House Floats, which basically decided if we can't have floats rolling down the streets in front of crowds, we will decorate houses to look like floats. So this year, the parades are back for the most part. I'm not going out that much myself, but definitely the spirit is still there and people are still doing what they want to do.
Well, the character of New Orleans plays such an important part, particularly in your newest book, the short story collection. I've just recently read a lot of the stories in it, and they all reveal a pretty tough side of this city, I think, or most of them do. And I'm really curious why you wrote this and how you came about with the characters in it. And I assume that a lot of these places aren't your usual haunts. And did you do a lot of research? It's a lot of questions all in one. So tell us about the book.
Yeah, well, you know, I think that New Orleans has an international reputation as one of the special cities in the world. So that reputation is so powerful, people tend to think they have an understanding of it. I wanted to sort of counter-program or counteract that by showing the sorts of people and places you never really see in advertisements or in films. And so in terms of like the research, just being from the city, I'm a total homer. I've always lived in the city, except for recently I've been doing some teaching work outside of the city. So for me, it was just a matter of considering people in my family, people that I had worked with, people that I had met over the years, and think about their personal stories, or even the stories of strangers. I mean, there's several stories that are about unhoused people in the collection. And that's just a matter of me asking them going to work every day and wondering, what's going on with them, and asking them questions sometimes, saying, hey, what's up?
So that title story, which is a hard-hitting story, the ones that don't say they love you, did you talk to, those boys that tap dance and sell themselves on the streets? And
Yeah, with that story in particular, because there have been generations of young men out on the street corners in the French Quarter dancing as a sort of cover for their sex work, I have seen them my whole life, but I didn't really know what they were up to until I talked to my wife about it. And she is a criminal attorney, and she just explained that, they would get taken in, or sometimes the jobs would get taken in. And so, in talking to her about it, I was really flabbergasted to learn these details. And as a fiction writer, it was irresistible to think, okay, I can create a narrative around this, create a voice around this. So that character's voice is very much the voice of young men I would have known when I was his age.
wow. And many of the stories in this book are very short. And I think glamour work or ones like that. Are they flash fiction? And what is flash fiction? And is that a genre that you have written much in?
Yeah. I love flash fiction. I think it's one of our most effective forms. They say that a short story is something that you can read in one sitting. I think flash fiction is a story you can, read in a single cup of coffee or less. I love the feeling of meeting somebody, getting their story, and getting out, which is kind of how we relate to people in real life. You might meet somebody, at an airport or a restaurant or at the grocery store, and they'll tell you in less than 5 minutes the most important thing ever happened to them because it's on their minds. That's how flash fiction is for me, and it's just so effective at conveying so much emotion and so much possibility in 5 pages or less, or something like that.
They're great. It's very powerful. And I'm struck by how powerfully you create characters with just a few brush strokes. It doesn't take a whole lot of description or narration, and you've made them come to life. And is that a gift you've always had? Is that something you've honed your skill around?
I definitely had to practice. When I would read flash fiction pieces, say 10 to 15 years ago, I was always just really struck by them, and I didn't understand them. So I literally tried to break down the different types and formats. And once I figured it out, I was able to just sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write 5 or 10 of these stories today and see how they come out. So that's what I did. And it's funny you asked, I didn't even think this was going to be part of the conversation, but a friend of mine, so I'm wearing this shirt that a friend gave me, and it's kind of hard to see. I'll try and show you the back of it. There's a structure for flash stories that I've talked about in the past. And so my friend put it on a shirt. So that's it right there. So
I love it.
yeah, so that's how I write my flash stories. Just using a sort of framework to keep it in shape, so to speak.
That's great. That's great. Well, I also read and understand that you have a lot of background in literature and literary references that you've used in some ways as models for a story or as influences for your work. Nabokov for your novel, people like that. Can you talk about your literary influences and how that's worked for you in developing your writing style?
Yeah, I think that most writers or readers first, and there are stories or works by writers that we fall in love with. And the wonderful thing about literature, about being a literary writer, is that it's totally okay to pay homage to the writers you love the most. And so I can say, in all honesty, with either my novel, We Cast a Shadow, or with my short stories, the vast majority of them have some relationship to some story or book that I read. And many of them also are partly based upon songs that I love. So it's just me tapping into that energy from somebody else's artistic creation.
Wow. Could you read a passage for us from one of your stories?
I'd love to, yes. So this is the book, The Ones Who Won't Say They Love You. And I'll read a flash piece. They're very convenient because they're so short. And I really love to always have a little bit of music before I get started. So that. This is on page 23. Mercury Forges, which is based on a true story. Mercury Forges. My job was to make sure Mercury Forges didn't escape. He was a stocky black guy in for drugs and guns. He'd gotten out of Orleans Parish prison twice, and no one knew how he did it. Funny thing is, he got captured within a few blocks of the prison both times. I get turned around out there when I get out, Benoit, Mercury said once. But I'll get free for good, just you wait. When the hurricane hit and flooded everything, we brought the inmates out to the Broad Street overpass. Now, I wasn't too panicked because one of the other deputies, Ronnie Dismas, said our families had made it out of town before the water came. It'd be easy to look after myself with them out of harm's way. Mercury snuck away as soon as I turned my back. He was in a pirogue, a boat about 5 blocks away, bobbing like an apple. I ran across the overpass and climbed down some scaffolding to his boat, which I grabbed. We hadn't cuffed any of the inmates. It would have been too hard to move them with all the climbing we had to do to get to dry land after the hurricane. Where do you think you're going? I asked. I had a hand on my sidearm. I gotta find Humanity Street, he said. That's where my pops lives. Now I knew his dad, a good guy who delivered food plates we deputies ate for lunch. And I liked his dad, but that shouldn't have mattered at the moment. I can't really tell you why I didn't make him bring us back to the detention area. And after a while, we floated up to a yellow house with floodwater, almost to the awning. Mercury yanked the metal pole from the water, broke through the attic window and climbed in. They were shuffling inside, and I wondered if I should go in after him. I thought this might be part of his big getaway plan. But soon, he grunted out of the window and pulled his father's body out, wrapped in a heavy blanket. The old man hadn't had a chance. Bring us back, Dep, said Mercury. And that was what I did. Mercury Forges.
Wow. You know, I think it's amazing the way you can put yourself in the point of view of the prison guard in one story and the point of view of the, you know, the convict in the next story. And you talk a little bit about how you do that?
I think there's different kinds of writers. I think that I'm a writer, perhaps in a different life would have been an actor. I love persona. I love getting into the shoes of other people and trying to see the world through their eyes. So with a story like this in particular, you know, I think I would probably be more along the lines of the guy who is trying to escape the deputy than being the deputy myself. But trying to see it from both points of view within really just a 2-page story is a bit of a challenge, and it's also a lot of fun. Because I think in the story, they can each kind of see each other in a way that I think is very humane, and it's a very New Orleans thing. You know, there are lines between different kinds of people, but because it's such a small city and it's such an intimate city, you go to a parade and you might see an off-duty deputy next to the guy who was in prison, you know, for 5 years with the same deputy. So that's how the city is, and that's how people are in general, I think.
I think that's the most important, maybe to me, the most important role of fiction is that we can put ourselves in the mindset and get all involved in the world of someone who's completely different than we are in a way that nonfiction or other styles of writing doesn't really invite us to do.
Yes, stories, particularly fiction stories, are empathy generators, people have said, and I agree with that. It's this idea of making that connection between two souls.
Your novel, We Cast a Shadow, is set in a dystopian city in the future where Blackness is criminalized. Can you talk to us about what it was like to imagine that world and to build that world in that novel?
Yeah, that was a lot of work because personally, I tend to be an optimist about everything in life, that things are getting better. But I think when I was writing it, here's the book right here, We Cast the Shadow. This is the hard copy version of the book. I was just trying to sort of push the quote unquote race problem to its not in conclusion, just to a further down the path level. And what I realized after I wrote it, because I was being interviewed by somebody on stage one day, and they asked, how did you do this? And I thought, and it just came out. I realized that what the character is experiencing in the book is what a lot of us experience on our worst days experiencing racism. So the feeling of just, going to a department store with your loved one, and you realize you're being followed by one of the workers in the store because they think you're stealing something. You have the money, you came in to purchase something, and yet you're being suspected of something. That's a very minor example, but I think probably the vast majority of Black folks and other marginalized people have experienced that. And so taking those kinds of things and bringing it up to a level that is, almost satirical or almost farcical, but certainly dystopian, I think it just shines a light on it. And I think that for some readers who initially may have began the book thinking, oh, this is so far-fetched, and then by the end of the book, I think most readers who had that mindset will go, oh, these things really are happening right now. Because I think good dystopian novels, like Handmaid's Tale, for example, are not really about the future, they're about the present. And I was very much trying to make that connection for people thinking about race in America.
It did that for me, certainly. It just said, this is the logical extension, maybe not even conclusion, of what we're seeing today. If things go the way they're going, this is what that looks like. And so it doesn't feel that far into the future. It feels like it's in the future, but not necessarily that far. I mean, I think you've dealt with some really big themes or concerns in America, certainly race and racism in the short story collection. Climate change is certainly a factor. Do you set about intentionally to talk about these themes, or does that's a part of the stories that you have to tell?
Yeah, I don't know that any of the characters that I've written are activists, except for maybe the young people in the story called Rhinoceros. But I do think that most of us have these moments in our day, we're minding our own business. Maybe we're staring at our phone, maybe we, going to work. We kind of think, climate change is real, or something else is real. And I think for my characters, it's real and it's in the background of their lives and it's affecting their lives constantly. So there's one story, there's two stories, for example, where people are living these stories and yet they're wearing masks because of the pandemic. That happens in Taylor University and it happens in Rhinoceros. And so I just think that we think about intersectionality in terms of like people's demographics and personal characteristics, but then also there's this sort of intersectionality in terms of the issues we're dealing with. We're all dealing with climate change plus economic issues plus racism or misogyny all at the exact same time, and therefore the characters must also deal with those things all at once.
So you weren't always writer, or maybe you were always writer, but you had a career as a lawyer. Can you talk a little bit about your path to becoming a writer and teacher of writing full time?
Yeah, thank you. I'm like most writers, which is to say, it's a mysterious path. If you decide in college to be an accountant or a lawyer, like I decided, there's a path to it. You make the decision, you get the degree. Next thing you know, you're sitting in office. It's just like a conveyor belt. But for writers, the path is just, it's not predetermined. You have to sort of fight for it and be innovative. So for me, it was a long journey of training myself up, keeping my spirits up, trying different types of stories, learning about the craft. And so, being a lawyer, I think whatever background you have will help you as a writer. It doesn't matter what you do. So for me, being a lawyer, it was helpful in that I learned how to argue. I learned how to argue against my original point. I learned how to see different points of view. I learned how to take the points of view of people I don't like very much. And then just even being a lawyer, you get to meet so many interesting people. Not always the most likable people, but definitely people that will give you sort of grist for your meal as a writer. So I just have been very fortunate to have this life where, I've been an attorney, I'm still an attorney also, but also a writer. I'm on the restaurant, I live in New Orleans. These things all together have made, give me a good foundation to stand on as a writer.
When did you start writing?
When I was a kid, I think that, again, like most of us, I didn't consider myself a writer, because what happens is, you get an assignment from a teacher in 7th grade and they say you do a good job with it, and you're like, oh, that's really cool. What you don't really understand is that not everybody has the sort of natural ability, but even more than that, not everybody has the sort of attraction to writing. There are so many writers who keep journals or write little poems or stories, and they just don't think of themselves as writers. But I would say those people, if you're doing that, you're a writer. People who, again, are just accountants or just truck drivers and not writing are not writers. But if you're writing anything, you're a writer. That's how I think of myself.
Well, yeah, they say a writer is someone who writes, right? And most of us say, well, I'm not a writer. So but I would say, personally, I say I'm not a fiction writer. I find fiction writing intimidating. And yet you write it and you teach it. And for me, it's like the difference between building a house from scratch or remodeling a house. At least remodeling, what the 4 walls are and some constraints around it. Whereas to build, everything's a possibility. So I wonder how you take someone like me or somebody who's just beginning or maybe intimidated by writing fiction, and can you teach them to write fiction?
Oh, of course. And I really appreciate your metaphor about remodeling the house versus building a house. Often when I'm working with somebody for the first time, I will remind them of either when they were a child, say a 6-year-old child, or if they have kids. And I will say, a 6-year-old comes home from school and they can tell you the entire story of your day in one long sentence with no pause. And all people have that capacity within us. We often forget it, that we had that ability, but we still have it. And so in some sense, flash fiction is one example, is related to that. You can just sit down and write out a narrative in the course of 10, 20, 30 minutes, and then refine it and revision. Fiction is not as scary as it seems because we all have this imagination. And I think that my job as a instructor or faculty in fiction writing is to say, okay, here are the tools you can use to get the ideas in your head onto the page so that you're not running around in circles and so that it feels fun to do it.
Yeah, I think I get caught up in the description part, and I'm a poet and nonfiction writer, so I get caught up in the words, I get caught up in the descriptions, and I forget to advance the plot. And I think what you do so beautifully is keep that really fast moving story going, the plot, at the same time with a very lyricism to the writing style. And you've captured dialogue and the vernacular and the characters. And all that seems to come together in a very short amount of time or in the length of a novel. And I admire that. And I also kind of wonder how you get there.
Thank you for all of that, Meg. It takes a lot of work to make stories seem that effortless.
Yeah.
Also, I think if there's a metaphor I can think of right now that applies. It's like if you're writing a story, it's like you're sprinting really quickly, and then behind you is this editor with a pen who's kind of like, wait a minute, you can fix this thing up really quickly, and you just have to outrun the editor until you get to the end of the story. And then you stop and you catch your breath and you say, all right, come on, what do you want to say, editor? And then the editor goes in and says, all right, you need a fancier word here, you need a better sentence structure there, you need a better ending here, and it's okay, but you can't let the editor rule you. You need to just be as free-spirited as possible in early drafts and then go back and make those changes to it.
I love that description. I never thought of it as the runner, but I've often thought of it because it is like 2 different sides of your brain. And if you allow that editor side to get in there, you'll never get the story down on paper, because he'll interrupt the story. So what's your creative process like? Do you write every day? Do you have a certain time? What's your What's your story in writing?
A long time ago, I realized that having too many processes was stifling for me. So I used to have a lucky pen, for example. If I lost my pen, I couldn't write. And so I realized I had to get rid of all the things that were blocking me. So to this day, my writing style and my schedule is completely open. I write when I want to write. I write where I want to write. But I think for me, what it really comes down to is that if I have a sort of voice in my head that I find really interesting, that voice will make me come back to my computer and get back to work. And so when I start a new story, it's always a matter of finding the proper character and the proper voice and kind of going, oh, I hadn't met her before. I wonder what she's up to. And then just wanting to hear her talk about the story until it's done. And so even the longest story in my collection, which is like 40 pages long, it was me just going back, everything saying, all right, Delia, what's up today? Well, you won't believe this. And then she just tells me the next part of the story. So that's my process.
And are you writing more than one story at any one time?
Sometimes, yeah, I think that sometimes a story I start, I can't figure out where it wants to go. So a couple of stories in the collection were like that. I mentioned Rhinoceros earlier. That story I started, and just unusually for me, I kept putting it down and going back to it and putting it down, taking a month off and going back to it until it finally came together. And that just tells me that, there's no one way to do anything. With fiction writing, because it's an art, you can be very, be kind to yourself. Don't feel guilt or shame because it's not going well. You take the time and have that patience to work out in the long run.
And what are you working on now?
What am I not working on now? I mean, I feel like I'm working on a collection of poetry. I'm working on a craft book about fiction writing. I'm working on a book that's either 3 novels or 1 novel. And then I kid you not, even just sitting with you just now, when we were talking, I have an idea for another novel. I'm like, that's a great idea in the back of my head. So it's a lot of things going on, but it's a lot of fun. I'm always writing essays for publications. I get asked to write things constantly. So it's all writing, so I enjoy it.
I love that. I heard somebody, a teacher of mine once say, well, I'm doing a lot of, she's a poet, poetry adjacent stuff, but it's okay. I'll get back to the actual poetry, And I think of some of the things that I do that are, that are writing adjacent, if you will, but they inspire, inform, infuse my writing. And it sounds to me like working in different genres, different styles, all of that all comes back to, oh yeah, there's another idea I can grab and get back to. Is that true for you?
That's exactly right. One of my mentors, John Digney, this professor in New Orleans, he told me, I said, how do you write everything? See, he wrote every type of genre possible. He said, look, my dad was a carpenter, and his dad could build a house from scratch by himself, build the foundation, the walls, the roof. And being a writer is exactly like that. All writers have all of the capacities to create whatever they want to create. And I tend to think, all right, I have not done this before, but I'll try it now, and I'll keep on trying until it works well.
That's great. I love it. And so we're in a world, I think, of information overload. There's so much coming at us, and so many things we could read or want to read, whether it's nonfiction or it's the news today or, what's happening, or poetry or fiction or whatever. What would be some of your recommendations? What you're reading, or what you think are just classics that you think people shouldn't miss reading?
Oh, sure. Oh, there's so many of them. I keep them nearby so they make my heart feel warm. I've always found this book by Ralph Ellison called The Invisible Man very inspirational. I feel like even though this book is very old, it's like 70 years old now, if not older, it really speaks to being a marginalized person in a country like America, where you're just trying to live your life and find your dreams, but you're being opposed by society. Anything by Toni Morrison, who I think is one of our greatest writers ever. It's marked up. I'm doing a book club with some students on this book right now, and she's just such a master of the form of large stories. And then right now I'm reading a book that I'm just getting into by Susan Choi called My Education. I love just finding new books, and you get into this new world and you just feel like, wow, this is such a cool place to be in. So her novelistic voice is so interesting, and I just find it very, very fun to read.
Great recommendations. And I did recall reading about the influence of Ralph Ellerson's Invisible Man on your writing and realized I've never read it. So that's going to be on my reading list. Is there anything I haven't asked that you would really like people to know about you or
I would say that for me, there are few pleasures in life that I enjoy more than learning things about myself. And I think that applies to all people who want to write. I think that if you come to a writing class, for example, it's because you really have a love for it. And I think that once you see yourself improving, you write a good story or whatever it is you do, that can be such a purifying thing for your spirit to have that achievement. And once you get started, you won't want to stop.
when you're seeing stories constantly like that, what makes, I start to think, well, okay, that story's already been told. So why should I tell a story? What makes me think I should write something?
That's
What would you say to someone like me?
Yeah, look, when I was just getting started, I had the same question. I read a book called The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz. And the book was about race, but it's from the point of view of a Dominican man who lived in New Jersey. And the book was so beautifully written. The language was beautiful, the plots and the characters, it's so big. I kept thinking, but I wanted to do this myself one day. And for a while, I was like, I don't know how to do it now, because he's already done it. And I realized that, we all have a unique voice. And so literally, if I tell a student, for example, write Romeo and Juliet, they're like, what? Yeah, take those two characters, write the exact same story. It doesn't matter. It's going to come out differently because we're all different people. And so, when I mentioned Invisible Man or I mentioned Oscar Wilde, my attempts to sort of recreate those stories makes a book like We Cast a Shadow. People don't read my book and go, oh, he's just copying that story. We're unique people. And therefore, when you create something, it's going to have your signature on it in all circumstances.
That's wonderful. It brings me back to one workshop I took years ago with John Paul Caponegro, a photography workshop. And one of the exercises we did, we all stood in the same place and took a picture and looked at each other's pictures, and they were all different. And after we'd been sharing work for a few days or better part of a week, he asked us then to take a picture in the style of so-and-so. And in fact, you could, because we each had our own way of looking at the world, seeing the world that was unique to us. And so I think you're saying the same thing about writing. It's all filtering through this unique human being. So you can't possibly be a total copy of somebody else.
Right, exactly.
And, and that's what makes it worth telling, is because no one else has your perspective on the world.
And that's a wonderful thing to think that you can create something that will, in theory, last forever, that nobody else could have created, not even Shakespeare.
In theory, lasts forever. There's also that element of craft, which it sounds like you give people all of the tools, I mean, not all, but certainly so many tools to bring the craft, to shape it, to make it something that other people are going to want to read.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a matter of simple metaphor is, if you're going to sit down and have some spaghetti, I'll give you a fork. You want to have some soup, I'll give you a spoon.
That's great. That's great. Well, I look forward to your fork and spoon and taking your workshop. That sounds wonderful. And it will be on campus this summer, right?
That is correct. I'm looking forward to being on campus.
That's great. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing you, Maurice. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
I've enjoyed it, Meg. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care. Have a great day. Have a fun Mardi Gras.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.